Hello and welcome to this very special program, Election 2020, The Future of U.S. Foreign Policy. I'm Christianne Hardy, Interim Director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I am joined today by three very special guests, each of whom has deep experience within or across agencies responsible for the implementation of the United States government's foreign policy. Our goal today is to elucidate the key differences between a possible second Trump administration foreign policy and that of a possible Biden administration. In short, to identify what is at stake from a foreign policy perspective in this November's election. Helping us to make sense of these differences are Ambassador Johnnie Carson, currently a senior advisor at the United States Institute of Peace. Ambassador Carson served in the U.S. Foreign Service for 37 years. His last position in the State Department was as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, a position he held from 2009 to 2013. Prior to that, he was the National Intelligence Officer for Africa at the National Intelligence Council. Ambassador Carson's Foreign Service career includes ambassadorships to Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Uganda, and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs. Earlier in his career, he had assignments in Portugal, Botswana, England, Mozambique, and Nigeria. He has also served as staff officer for the Secretary of State and staff director for the Africa Subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives. This is not Ambassador Carson's first visit to Dartmouth. He was a Magro Family Distinguished Visitor in International Affairs at the Dickey Center in 2018 and taught a class on U.S. policy in Africa. It may, however, be his first virtual visit. Also joining us is Dr. Chris Savos, Vice President of Special Projects at JTG Inc. and Director of Proficiency One, an online training company launching this year for national security and risk intelligence professionals. He also designs and delivers leadership, analytic, and professional skills training programs to a range of clients in the intelligence community and private sector. Dr. Savos has 22 years of experience as an executive manager, leader, analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency, where he earned the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, the agency's highest award for career service. He has held numerous leadership positions within the CIA, running regional analytical units that followed sensitive security and foreign policy issues in the Middle East and South and East Asia. As Deputy Director of the Weapons Intelligence, Nonproliferation, and Arms Control Center, he helped drive agency analysis of foreign weapons of mass destruction, conventional weapons, space, and technology development programs. Chris also served a tour on the National Intelligence Council as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia, in addition to spending several years in the Directorate of Operations. He is a Dartmouth graduate of the great class of 1988. Rounding out our panel is Ann Witkowsky, a national security expert who has held leadership positions across government and the private sector. Currently a non-resident senior democracy fellow at Freedom House, Ms. Witkowsky's most recent government position was as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Stability and Humanitarian Affairs, where she advanced Obama administrative initiatives such as support for UN peace operations and the U.S. Ebola response. Prior to that role, she held leadership positions in the State Department's Bureau of Counterterrorism, building civilian programs and policies to prevent terrorism. She has also served on the White House National Security Council staff as a Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control. In between stints in government, Ms. Witkowsky was a Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She is the recipient of the Secretary of Defense Medal for Distinguished Civilian Service and the Department of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service, as well as Superior and Meritorious Honor Awards from the Department of State. She is also the proud parent of a member of the class of 2024, pardon me. Welcome to you all. I have asked each of our panelists to provide a very short, high-level summary of how they view the key differences between the two possible administrations before voters in the fall. Ambassador Carson, let's begin with you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back on the Dartmouth campus, even if it is virtual. Foreign policy under the Trump administration has often been erratic and confusing, but it has mostly been characterized by an American First agenda. Under Trump's American First agenda, the current administration has taken a unilateralist approach to many of the challenges confronting the United States and the international community. The Trump administration has generally downplayed and sometimes damaged relations with many of our strongest and closest allies in NATO and Western Europe. It has pulled out of important international agreements and organizations, including the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and now the threat to move forward in pulling out of the WHO. It has cozied up to a number of the world's worst authoritarians and dictators in Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. The administration has also downplayed issues like human rights, climate change, and global health issues. And it has frequently been at odds with the United Nations. I think that under a Biden administration, and I certainly do not speak for the Biden administration, I would think that they would seek to bring some order and strategic clarity to America's foreign policy. They would reinvigorate their relationship with key partners and allies in Western Europe and in Asia. They would strengthen the relationship with NATO and also with Germany, France, Great Britain, and some of the other key partners in that part of the world. I think a Biden administration would also strengthen its international relationships. It would go back into the Paris Climate Change Agreement. It would probably remain in the WHO. It would work very hard with the UN on some of the more troubling transnational issues. I think the Biden administration would also look at trade issues in a more strategic and clear fashion. It would probably reinvigorate its effort to become a part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It would look again at trying to establish a free trade relationship with Western Europe. And it certainly would do more on key transnational issues across the board, from climate change to trying to renew a global effort to contain Iran's nuclear threat. And it would certainly give human rights and support for democracy and inclusion greater priority than the current administration. I'll stop right there as an opening thought. I can elaborate on some of those as we go forward.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Savos, your thoughts?
Johnnie, I think you shared most of my thoughts already. I'll try and add on and not just repeat. When I thought about this, I really looked at it from the standpoint of what are these different ways that a second Trump administration and a Biden administration would think and act in foreign policy. And I came up with 5 main differences. And I think, Johnnie, you actually touched on most of these. The first one, I think, is under a Biden administration. It would be much more of a national interest-based foreign policy, something that we all can tend to understand. Whereas I see what we have now is much more of a personal interest-based, and it's much more difficult to figure out what those personal interests actually are at any point in time. And closely related to that is a move back to what I would say is the more traditional and predictable approach in the United States to foreign policy in terms of how we behave in the world, as opposed to what I would call the last 4 years of maybe novel and unpredictable in terms of some of the things that happened. I think about just, looking at how we have dealt with North Korea. There was a very traditional way that we've done it. There's a very non-traditional way we've done it in the last few years. I expect we'll go back to more traditional. Johnnie, something you said that I think is hugely important and is going to really be probably the primary difference is the belief among a Biden administration, I would say, going back to collective action and this idea that alliances are actually a source of strength, as opposed to a much more unilateralist approach that we've had for the past few years, where alliances are almost seen as a sign of weakness. And this idea that there's really no such thing as a win-win in international relations. And we always have to be the ones coming out on top there. So I definitely see a difference there. From the standpoint of how I used to be involved in the process, I see a difference of going back again to actually having a formal process that is understandable and somewhat predictable, as opposed to one that's driven more by personality. And here I don't just mean by the president's personality, but by the personalities of various peoples in different parts of the administration. So I see it going back again to a more predictable approach. And I think the last main difference, and Johnnie, you touched on this too, is a U.S. foreign policy that goes beyond just interest-based, however you want to define that interest, to values-based, and starting to talk more about democracy and human rights, and looking at the rise of authoritarianism in the world in a very different way than it's been looked at in the last 3 years. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Batting cleanup, Ann Witkowsky?
Yeah, great. I think the one thing I would add to what's been said about what former Vice President Biden has articulated about his approach is that he believes in the connectivity between America at home and America abroad. And if you look at some of the things that he's said, he's talked a lot about the need to lead by example, the need to restore our own democracy as a source of power and influence in working together with other countries, other like-minded countries, other democracies abroad. And I would echo what my predecessors have said also, Chris and Ambassador Carson have said, in that I think he would absolutely focus more as a priority on concerns regarding the rollback of democracy around the world, about illiberal trends, and in countering authoritarianism. And we can come back to the process question. I think there will be some restoration of the processes that in a Biden administration that we as professionals came to know in both Republican and Democratic administrations in modern times.
Great. Thank you all very much. So it sounds like radically different worldviews, right? Evidenced by something I've heard repeated across the three of you between a sort of America first approach versus a multilateral, constructive engagement, global engagement through alliances. What about where the nature of the threats might be? So different worldviews, how are sort of the threats to U.S. security and U.S. interests articulated between these two camps?
If you want me to start first, I shall, and say that there will probably be one similarity that touches both administrations, and that in fact is the rise of China. China's growing influence in Asia, the rise of China's military and sea power, China's influence in technology, in cybersecurity, in 5G technology, and in digital communications and surveillance. I think that China's rise has come to the attention of both parties and both candidates. How they deal with China, however, will be starkly different. I believe that in a Biden administration, there will be a more strategic and sophisticated approach towards China, looking at ways that the United States can cooperate with China, looking at avenues and areas where there will be competition with China, and there will be on occasion red lines where the United States will want to say no and talk about those seriously. So I think that under a Biden administration, you'll see the whole complex layer of policy, strategy, and diplomacy being carried out. I think that under a second Trump administration, we will come very, very close to confrontation with China. And we could, in fact, end up in a new Cold War with China. And we might even find ourselves in conflict in one or two soft spots with China. Instead of taking a strategic approach, I think it will be, as Chris noted, a lot of personal approach. I think that ad hocism will rule the day, and that there will not be a great deal of thought about how the China matrix is handled. But under a Biden administration, I see beyond China 2 or 3 other areas that will be important to deal with. I certainly look at the administration trying very hard to have a strategic approach towards Russia and Russia's aggressive expansionism into Central Europe. I think there is concern about Russia's bad behavior, especially towards its near neighbors. I think there will be a continued interest in looking at both the South Asia axis of problems, and there I am thinking specifically of Afghanistan and Iraq, and an effort to continue to draw down and disentangle there. And I think also taking a look at the Middle East. I think those are the 4 areas. I think with a Trump administration, I can expect more erratic foreign policy behavior. I see, as I said, confrontation and conflict with China over technology, over trade, over South China Sea, not handled well. I don't see any improvement in the relationship with NATO or Germany or France. I certainly don't see any commitment to dealing with global transnational issues like global warming, like the issues of nuclear arms control. I'll stop right there. There are a bunch of things that will remain the same and will be disconcerting and dizzying as we watch the administration handle its foreign policy if it has a second term.
Great. Thank you. Other thoughts?
I'll just add on the China side. The way I see it is, another Trump administration will continue what I see as a policy of a very aggressive confrontation with China, but only along one dimension, really, which is the economic and trade side. In the other areas, I really haven't seen a lot. They're not saying much about what happened in Hong Kong or what goes on within the country. Whereas I see under a Biden administration, because there's different values that they're pursuing, you could have a less intense but much broader front of confrontation. And the Chinese are always very sensitive about United States comments about what they're doing domestically. There's going to be a lot more of those under a Biden administration than there would be under a Trump administration. On the Russia side, I agree completely with what Johnnie said. I think a Biden administration is not going to be any more free lunch for the Russians in terms of what they're doing in this country, in terms of what they're doing in border states, and basically what they're doing around the world to to pretty aggressively undermine U.S. interests everywhere. So I think that's going to be a big change for U.S. foreign policy that have a lot of implications for everything from military posture to technology policy to, again, rebuilding those alliances that have unraveled a bit.
And you've done a lot of work around counterterrorism. Focus has been sort of removed from a lot of the work that a previous administration has undertaken. How do you view a potential Biden administration looking at those measures versus a second Trump administration?
Right. Well, I think what we know so far is that in one particular area, I think there'll be actually kind of a point of continuity, and that is the commitment, I think, both that we've seen from the Trump administration and from Joe Biden in his candidacy to bring the vast majority of our troops home from Afghanistan and Iraq, focusing our mission in Afghanistan on Al-Qaeda and in Iraq on ISIS. So there may be different ways that we go about this. There may be surely differences in the details, but I think in the broad parameters, there seems to me anyway to be some similarities. One challenge that is we all face going forward, without commenting on where a Biden administration would necessarily go, but that is questions around repatriation of former fighters, about countering violent extremism, about how to stabilize to stabilize societies, fragile states, where there may be opportunities for the continued spread of terrorist organizations. So that's a general challenge that I think we face into the future. And I don't think we know just yet exactly which administration, whether the Trump presidency, a second Trump presidency term, or a Biden administration would exactly behave on these issues. I think we know from my own service in the Obama administration that there would definitely be an emphasis on what to do on the civilian side of this huge challenge that we face if we don't want to be in forever wars into the future.
Great, thank you. Well, so you raise an interesting point about the utilization of different levers of foreign policy available to the administration. So whether it's partnering with, say, civilian organizations in the effort to counter terrorism abroad, or using the agencies of the U.S. government, the intelligence agencies, the Department of Defense, et cetera. What are likely to be the broad differences between a Trump administration and a Biden administration in terms of the utilization of the different levers of foreign policy?
Would you like, is that directed
Sure,
at me?
you take it. You go.
All right. Well, I feel like Ambassador Carson might usefully get a good shot at this because of his long service in the State Department. But I think we know that former Vice President Biden has really focused already on the importance of diplomacy as the first instrument of American power. That's what he said. I think that's what he believes. We've already articulated some ways in which he might advance our interests through diplomacy. And I think that focus will be reflected in his views of the institutions themselves that exercise that. So first and foremost, the State Department, and reinvigorating the Foreign Service, or elevating, I would say, the Foreign Service as a principal tool of foreign policy. I can see some changes that could be made with respect to some of the inner workings of the U.S. government that are not generally visible to the public, in terms of the way that that the U.S. government lays out its policies, considers options, executes and implements its policy through the instrument of the National Security Council staff, where I served for a very long time. One other thing I'd just like to say about a potential Biden administration is that former Vice President Biden has committed to seek gender parity in his senior national and full diversity in his senior national security appointments. So he's clearly given some thought to the way that he wants his top officials, his leadership group to look. And I think that says something about the way that he's thinking about the way that he wants to run our foreign policy, to draw on the talent of our nation to advance our goals as effectively as we can. It's harder for me to speak of what a second Trump term would look like in this particular area. I think we've seen that there just hasn't been a whole lot of focus on these institutions and on the career folks who are in them.
Ambassador Carson, anything you wanted to pick up on?
I would agree fully with what Ann has said. The White House currently has held the career foreign service and the professionals at the State Department in fairly low regard. Mm-hmm. The administration over the last 3.5 years, has hollowed out the professional corps at the State Department. It has retired a number of senior officers and not filled key jobs for months, if not years, both in Washington and overseas at key embassies abroad. The administration has also put in an increasingly large number of political appointees into positions that were formerly held by career State Department officers, and they've certainly increased the number of political appointees at overseas missions. I think that the current administration's disregard and disdain for the foreign policy establishment in Washington is reflected in its annual budget requests to Congress for the State Department, USAID, and the other international development agencies and organizations. Certainly on the development and foreign policy side, the administration has consistently sent budgets to Capitol Hill with significant cuts in them, as much as 30% for aid and the State Department in recent years. Thankfully, that money has been restored by the Congress, but the fact that the administration continues to send budget requests forward that significantly reduce the funding for the foreign affairs agencies is a reflection of how it feels about the professional corps.
Understood. Dr. Savos, speaking about the intelligence communities, we know that the current administration has had its tussles with the intelligence community. How do you view a distinction between what a potential Biden administration would do and what has been the way in which that community has been treated by the Trump administration?
I don't think it'd be more different. Now, I always have to say that the remarks I'm going to make are my own. I've been out of the intelligence community for a few years, but it's really a dramatically different picture. I think if you get another Trump administration, one of the things that happens is you kind of are going to lose the space for objective analysis being given to policymakers, that the continued politicization is going to get to a point where there just isn't going to be any more objective analysis leaving the building, going to the normal set of customers downtown. Another thing that the intelligence community really focuses on is our foreign partnerships. And those have been kind of left in tatters. And I think that will continue under a second Trump administration. It makes it very hard for the agency if other other countries don't trust our word and don't trust what we're going to do, it makes us harder to have partners come along with us. I also think, on a more personal standpoint, thinking about the people involved, that another Trump administration will lead to two things: a continued hunkering down of we're just going to get through this until we're back to some sense of normality, but also I think a surge in retirements. There is a significant percentage, certainly of the analytic core, that is of retirement age, but stays on because frankly they love the job and they love the mission. Their ability to actually do the mission they signed up for originally has been severely degraded. So I think you would see a lot of that. Now, if Biden comes back, I would expect a little bit more of a return to normality, of an expectation that one of the core things that I was supposed to do as an analyst is tell truth to power. There is absolutely no appetite right now for telling truth to power. So I think that would come back in. I would certainly expect that under Biden. I think you would also see a return to a feeling of there's respect for the people who literally risk their lives in the intelligence community to perform their mission. And I always go back to the very first day of the Trump administration, well, I guess the second day, the 21st of January, 2017. Very surprisingly, one of the first things he did was he visited CAA headquarters. And he did it in a way that, in my opinion, basically spit in the face of every person who sacrificed their life for that organization because of where he chose to make very personally aggrandizing political remarks in front of the wall of stars at the agency. And it just has gone downhill from there. Also, I think with Biden coming back, we'll get more to that normality that I talked about. So a predictability in terms of the interagency process and how the intelligence community plays into that. And then the last thing, I already kind of mentioned the flip side of it, was being able to rebuild those foreign relationships so that we have a greater ability to work with partners around the world.
Wow. So radically different worldviews, radically different views about the utility of the different agencies of foreign policy that exist for the implementation of an administration's policy. Some serious challenges with the potential for funding, retirements, a sort of a hollowing out of these agencies. It sounds like a potential Biden administration is going to have a lot of work to do if he wants to use the traditional arms of U.S. foreign policy in the ways that they previously existed. What might be the top three things that a Biden administration would need to do if elected?
I think from the intelligence community, it's easy. Just going back to having respect for the mission and the objectivity, and to actually listen to your own intelligence community more than you listen to enemies of the United States. It's easy for him on the intelligence community side, in my opinion.
What about within the State Department, Ambassador Carson?
I think a Biden administration would bring back in a number of senior career officers at high levels, make critical appointments in Washington and overseas that would reassure our partners and allies that we're back in the business of collaboration, partnership, and cooperation. I think that critically, who the Secretary of State is, who the deputy secretaries are, who are the key assistant secretaries, and who are placed in key ambassadorial appointments, including the UN and in other parts of the world, will clearly show where the Biden administration is going. I think that bringing in, and there are a number of them, very well-placed senior individuals who have been a part of the career service, bringing them back in strategically, if even for just short periods of time, will have a very high motivational impact. I think officers who have run away from difficult and non-controversial posts will come back in and be willing to take on more difficult and challenging jobs, both in Washington and overseas. I don't think that we lack the talent inside the building, and I don't think that we lack the ability to bring in young and able newcomers into the diplomatic service. I think it is the leadership at the top giving a inspirational and strategic message about the importance of the work they do and the value of the people who do it will in fact bring about the kind of quick recovery that we need. The real question is the question of how quickly our partners will respond.
Excellent question there. And Witkowsky, I mean, thinking about all of the different agencies that play in coordinating policy across both official and allied partners for U.S. foreign policy, you know, potentially how long could this take? I mean, how big is the challenge that a Biden administration has before them to utilize these resources that were previously there to enact a policy that clearly relies upon them, if it's going to be multilateral, if it's going to be, you know, engaging a variety of our partners? How much time?
Right. Well, I think Ambassador Carson put it very well when he said the key factor is leadership. The talent is there. The question is leadership. And so in that sense, I think changes can be made very quickly. Yes, we need to bring up the next generation, not only in the Foreign Service, but through our civil service tracks, through our intelligence service tracks. We need to continue to do that, to continue to recruit. I think the talent and the interest is there among our young people. The question is, how would a Biden administration affect greater utilization, enhancing morale, and generally deployment of the talent in these agencies? And so I think we need to start. The Biden administration would need to start with the question of leadership. I think an important piece of that will be the way that the National Security Council staff is organized. Again, this is not an area that we see a lot of from the outside looking in. For those of us who have served in government, it is clear, however, that how the White House organizes itself, what it chooses to focus on, how it chooses to set priorities, what it leaves to agencies, especially the Department of State and the Department of Defense, as well as our other national security agencies, to implement. How effectively it does that can matter. It can matter a lot. And I think this is an area that will be very important for next administration to focus on. One detail that that Joe Biden has mentioned already is that he will seek to reestablish the Global Health Security Office. Mm-hmm. It may not have exactly that name, but it will be the office that was in place before and that focuses on pandemics and working with our friends and allies, potentially not only on the COVID response, we'll probably still be in a response phase on the COVID recovery, but on preparing for, planning for, thinking about what might come our way next.
Great, thanks. Other thoughts on, you know, priorities for a Biden administration coming in, you know, given the current circumstances of our foreign policy agencies?
I think Anne touched on one, and I think that there has been a de-emphasis on a number of issues, and I think you can see a Biden administration putting more emphasis on respect for human rights, more emphasis on support for democracy, rule of law, fair and transparent elections. I can see an elevation of the part of the department that deals with climate change. There will be a greater role given to the Assistant Secretary who deals with ocean, environment, and scientific issues. They will be empowered. I can see a stronger emphasis being placed on issues related to youth globally, and to gender equity, both in our foreign policy and, as mentioned, the importance of having it in our bureaucracy, but it will also become an increasingly important issue in our in foreign policy in engagement. And I think there will be a renewed emphasis on technology and the foreign policy implications of technology and how we deal with technology across national borders and boundaries, both of the technical side as well as the messaging side. So I think all of those things are likely to come out of this. I think that the fact that the Trump administration has de-emphasized some of these issues will highlight, if a Biden administration comes in, the elevation of them once he's in office.
Understood.
And I
So
think,
go ahead, please.
I think the challenge of what Ambassador Carson just said is you have a priority system that seems to work now of, okay, right now it's Iran, and now it's North Korea, and now it's this, and now it's that. And it's very focused, but it kind of jumps around.
Mm-hmm.
But what you just laid out is now there's all of this stuff we're going to start caring about again, and getting those wheels turning in all those different places is going to be a real challenge, I think.
Right. So the shift from a very minimalist, more narrowly defined foreign policy as has existed under the Trump administration, one that doesn't include, scientific cooperation, doesn't include, sort of a global health front, doesn't include, youth development or these kinds of issues, right? Shifting from a very narrowly defined, focused, but perhaps rapidly moving focus in the Trump administration to a much more comprehensive, sustained, expansive understanding of foreign policy under the Biden administration is a pretty heavy lift. But I'm hearing from those of you who have familiarity within the different agencies, the capacity is there. It just needs to be motivated. Is that correct? Yeah.
I think that the U.S. has always, up until now, in recent years, had the capacity to undertake multiple foreign policy objectives and strategies across the globe on geographic issues as well as on functional issues. I think that if you have a fully empowered State Department and an effective National Security Council staff, both aided and in collaboration with an intelligence community, the U.S. has the capacity to undertake multiple foreign policy objectives at the same time. Some of them are bound together by the need for collaboration with our partners. I think both Chris and Ann have, in their comments, have both noted the fact that we, as a nation, do best when our foreign policy is backed by our principles and values at home, and where there is broad consensus at home based on our principles and values for doing the things that we do abroad. People know that they can see a level of integrity, sincerity, and honesty in what we're trying to accomplish and achieve. But the other part of it is the fact that we need partnerships and alliances to be able to effectively try to create a global environment which is not only good for the United States, but good for all of our partners and all of the larger community that we live in. The United States can't accomplish an improvement in climate change alone. We can do it in collaboration and partnership with others. We can't change China's behavior alone, but we can do it better in collaboration and partnership with others. But if we, in fact, take the opposite approach of not doing anything about climate change, then it only gets worse. We're the anchor to the progress that needs to be made. If we don't do anything with China except make the relationship worse, we disadvantage our own country economically and politically, and China gets the benefit of us being the odd person out.
Understood. So two excellent points that you're making. One is the need to have some consensus domestically on the values and the policies that we want to project internationally, problematized by the fact that there's not a whole lot of consensus on many things in the United States today. So I'd be curious to get your viewpoints on the degree to which our own domestic polarization problematizes any foreign policy, whether it's of the Trump administration or a potential Biden administration. And then secondly, the sort of the international response. Where do we have the biggest challenges facing us globally, either in alliance formation, partnership forming, or in potential hostile environments? Two questions out there for you. I don't know, Ann, Chris, if you want to tackle either of those.
I'll try the first one, which was, now I've lost my train of thought. The first one, which was on how hard it's going to be to get people to actually listen, given that we're divided at home. I think a lot of the different things that we need to do that Johnnie was talking about comes down to, are people really going to trust us that we've gone back to who we used to be as opposed to who we've been the last 3 years? And the more divided we are after the election, the more people are going to think, okay, maybe this is what it's going to be now, but can I really trust the United States to be the country that it was in the entire post-war period? Maybe not. And that's going to affect us in a lot of ways, in terms of people actually signing up to agreements with us, in terms of the fact that we talked earlier about the different levels of levers of power to bring to foreign policy. We don't have soft power anymore. The overall view of the United States and other countries, I don't think, has ever been lower. No one aspires to be us anymore. They're wondering what the heck's going on. And that's a very different place to operate when you're trying to take a role of leadership in the international stage. And we've sort of stepped back from that role. Stepping back into that, you don't just get to do it and have everyone suddenly accept you. And I think that's going to be a really big challenge for us.
Excellent. What about on the international perspective? So you've talked about states not trusting us. How much harder is that going to make? Certainly, it sounds like for a Biden administration, which really is going to rely on a kind of multilateral approach to these complex problems, how much harder would that make for a Biden administration? But also, what are the ways in which it problematizes what a Trump administration would want to do or is doing?
Well, I think Chris really put his finger on it, in the sense that if there is a Biden administration, the conversation will not only be about what are the Biden administration's policies, how are they different from the Trump administration's policies, but what's going to happen into the future? Will there be consistency? Can we continue to come to the table with you and trust that there will be follow through on whatever these commitments are that you're asking us to sign up to? So I think this change could take a little bit of time, and there's no question that what's going on within our own borders is going to influence the perspective of our friends and allies and others, as to influence their perspective on who we are and what it is we're saying, what it is we're asking, and how it is we're seeking to influence with respect to our own policies at the table. And I think that's one reason why Biden has really focused on this connectivity between policies at home, investing in education and criminal justice reform and infrastructure and our economy, because there's an understanding of the influence of how other countries see us on how effective we might be in rebuilding those partnerships abroad. I'm sorry about that. But Biden has said something which I very much like in his candidacy in an article back in the spring, and that is the world does not organize itself. And so I think, although we've talked a little bit about the U.S. stepping back from a leadership role, it's my personal view that our leadership would be in the right way, would be most welcome again going forward.
Yeah. If I could just throw in a thought there and say that I think that while people will, as Chris points out, be suspicious and distrustful initially, I think that the receptivity of us coming back to normal will be welcome and probably more warmly received in places where we've always had strong partners, and that's in Western Europe and in some of our key Asian alliances, including Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. I think where it's going to be more difficult is in places where leaders and governments have taken advantage of the fact that the U.S. Has not been engaged actively or forcefully or in a committed fashion in defending democracy, rule of law, and human rights, where we have not been as forceful in condemning the reversals of democracy or the reversals of political space held by opposition leaders. And we have not, in fact, been condemnatory of transgressions against women and LGBT community members and religious groups. I think where there has been human rights, democracy, and equity backsliding, those countries and those leaders probably are far more bold and empowered now because of what's gone on with our foreign policy, as well as what they see in our own country, that it will be harder to reverse the clock with them, but it can be done. I'm optimistic that as we deal with our partners, our long-standing partners, that they will be happy to see that the fever has been broken in Washington and that things are now on a more healthy track.
Sounds like a mixed bag for whichever administration is declared the victor, hopefully very shortly after the election, and that in either case, both potential administrations would suffer from an election without a clear result or a clear concession from the loser. Fascinating. I'm looking forward to rejoining you at that moment post-election, when we can talk again about what's ahead for U.S. foreign policy, when we know who that administration is. Thank you very much, all three of you, for joining us. And we'll see you back in November.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Hello and welcome. I'm Christianne Hardy, Interim Director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this live question and answer with three prominent U.S. foreign policy practitioners regarding what is at stake for the U.S. foreign policy in this year's election. Earlier this month, we recorded a conversation with our guests, which I encourage you to view on the Dickey Center YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. In it, our guests lay out the broad implications for U.S. foreign policy for a second Trump term versus a Biden administration. Today's event and the pre-recorded session have been made possible due to the generosity of Tony and Laurence Magro, whose family fund supports distinguished visitors in international affairs at the Dickey Center. Just as a notification, this discussion is being recorded. Today, we're going to entertain your questions for our guests. With us are three foreign policy practitioners with deep and broad experience across the main agencies of U.S. foreign policy, including the State Department, National Security Council, Department of Defense, intelligence agencies, and with congressional committees. Ambassador Johnnie Carson served in the U.S. Foreign Service for 37 years, culminating in his role as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, a position he held from 2009 to 2013. He was the National Intelligence Officer for Africa at the National Intelligence Council and held ambassadorships in Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Uganda, as well as serving as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs. His prior Foreign Service experience includes assignments in Portugal, Botswana, England, Mozambique, and Nigeria. He has served as staff officer for the Secretary of State and staff director for the Africa Subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives. He is currently a senior advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace, an independent, nonpartisan organization created by Congress working to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict. Ambassador Carson is a former Magro Distinguished Visiting Fellow in International Affairs at the Dickey Center. Dr. Chris Savos spent 22 years with the Central Intelligence Agency, where he earned the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, the agency's highest award for career service. He has held numerous leadership positions within the CIA, running regional analytical units that followed sensitive security and foreign policy issues in the Middle East and South and East Asia. As Deputy Director of the Weapons Intelligence, Nonproliferation, and Arms Control Center, he helped drive agency analysis of foreign weapons of mass destruction, conventional weapons, space and technology programs. Chris also served a tour on the National Intelligence Council as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia, in addition to spending several years in the Directorate of Operations. He is currently Vice President at JTG Inc. and Proficiency One, an online trading company for national security and risk intelligence professionals. He is also a member of the Great Class of 1988. Anne Witkowsky is a national security expert whose most recent government position was as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Stability and Humanitarian Affairs under President Obama, where she worked on issues related to UN peace operations and the U.S. Ebola response. Prior to that, she held leadership positions in the State Department's Bureau of Counterterrorism, building civilian programs and policies to prevent terrorism. She has also served on the White House National Security Council staff as Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control. She is the recipient of the Secretary of Defense Medal for Distinguished Civilian Service and the Department of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service, as well as the Superior and Meritorious Honor Awards from the Department of State. She is currently a non-resident Senior Democracy Fellow at Freedom House, a U.S. government-funded, nonprofit, non-governmental organization that conducts research and advocacy on democracy, political freedom, and human rights. She is also the proud parent of a member of the Class of 24. Welcome back to you all. We are now less than 2 weeks away from the U.S. presidential election, and new international security concerns are emerging all the time. Since we spoke, President Trump gave a speech at the UN attacking China and reiterating his America First position. There has been a new deal in the Middle East between Israel, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. U.S. intelligence agencies are reporting on Russian and Iranian meddling in the election, and the pandemic has now killed more than 1 million people worldwide and is entering a third wave in some locations. Later this evening, our two candidates will debate live for a second time. Before we turn it over to audience questions and answers, which can be submitted through the Q&A function, let me ask each of you in turn how, if at all, the events of the last few weeks since we last spoke have influenced your thinking of what is at stake from a foreign policy perspective in this election. Let's begin with you, Ambassador Carson.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me back. My views on the Trump administration's foreign policy have not changed as a result of developments over the last 5 or 6 weeks. In fact, the course of the administration's foreign policy underscores what they have been doing all along. I think the administration will continue to pursue an American first agenda. I think that the administration will continue to pursue an erratic and unpredictable foreign policy path. I think that it will continue to focus heavily on China, not as a competitor, but an adversary, a country to be feared and a country to be dealt with. And I think it will continue to look down at the influential and important role that our partners in NATO and some in Western Asia play in helping to create an international order that is favorable to the United States and to democratic countries around the world. So I don't see very much change. America first, combined with erratic and unpredictable foreign policy behavior.
Great. Thank you, sir. Dr. Savos, any new thoughts since our last conversation?
Not really. I agree with everything that Johnnie said about things not really changing, but I did want to highlight one thing that I found really interesting and maybe a little ironic. And this was Secretary of Defense Esper's announcement on Tuesday at the Atlantic Council of the Guidance for Development of Alliances and Partnerships, which talks about the asymmetric advantage that our alliances give us over Russia and China. And I just thought that was very odd that DOD is staking out a position that is very much at odds with what we see the Trump administration doing. And I think it's the right approach, but oddly, it's one that will mesh very well with what I think we all see a Biden administration doing, which is moving back to a more predictable, traditional approach to foreign policy as opposed to what we're seeing now. So I think DOD gets it right here. It's a question of how you get the rest of the government to follow along, because this really has to be a whole of the government effort. I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Ann Witkowsky.
I think those are both excellent points. And to Chris's point, we also see a pace of redeployment from Afghanistan and Europe that may not be consistent necessarily with some of the president's pronouncements. So to your point about DOD, Chris, I think there's some things underneath the surface that are going on that folks need to understand. The other Chris, you mentioned a number of developments since we taped the panel abroad, but there also been some additional developments at home. And I just wanted to underscore the point about looking at ourselves if we want to rejoin the world as a leader, as the kind of leader that they're accustomed to seeing on the world stage. So what are some of the things that's happened in the last few weeks? President Trump has gotten over COVID, but the policies that he's put in place in terms of addressing the nation's crisis really haven't changed. There have been large rallies, no masks, and castigating our nation's top epidemiologist. He has retreated a conspiracy theorist theory that perhaps the death of bin Laden was faked and that SEAL Team 6 killed a body double. We have a disinformation issue here at home, and the president apparently has doubled down on that. As you did mention, the FBI briefed a couple of days ago that it's not only Russia's desire to sow chaos in our election, process, but apparently Iran as well. So as we're talking about foreign policy and our role in the world and the role that we may want to play, or some of us think that we should play, I think it's really important to consider how we need to double down on emphasizing what that means and the related importance of putting our own house in order, restoring faith in our own government, having strong and accountable institutions at home here in order to underpin what it is that we feel we need to pursue and should be pursuing abroad, bilaterally and multilaterally for national security. Thank you.
Mhm.
So while we're waiting for questions to come in for our audience, which you can do through the Q&A function, one of the points that we had discussed in our last gathering was the challenge of comparing two foreign policy platforms, one which is fully articulated as a platform, i.e. that of the Biden campaign, and versus, as Johnnie had said, a foreign policy of the current administration, which has been unpredictable, partly by design, partly by personality. And I'm wondering if there are advantages to an unpredictable foreign policy that might be a strategic a point for a possible second Trump administration. And I realize I'm asking this of individuals have spent your entire careers within agencies whose job it is to articulate those policies and make them consistent. So I realize this is a challenging question to you, but I'm just wondering, from a global perspective, the advantages of unpredictability, for U.S. foreign policy.
I think that most of the challenges that we face as a nation are challenges that confront us on a global basis, and that we are best when we are accompanied by our closest friends and allies, because the challenges that America faces, which are most determinate, are transnational in nature. I look at things like terrorism today. Terrorism is not exclusively an issue related to the U.S. I think of climate change, which is a global issue. I think of issues related to narco-terrorism, money laundering. All of those are major transnational issues. But even those issues that we frequently highlight as major bilateral issues are better resolved with a strategy and with a group of allies who know exactly what our strategy is and are in alignment with it. I think we are better off dealing with a rising China, not in an American first, an American alone position, but dealing with a rising China with our democratic Western European allies, and with our allies, our democratic and military allies in Asia. I think that we're better off dealing with Russia in the same manner, not singularly as a US-Russia problem, but also as an issue in which we can join with our NATO partners and allies. So many of the things that we look at as discretely bilateral really are global. And if we don't take into account that we need to work with partners and allies, we will be the lesser for it in the kinds of policies that we're able to pursue and achieve.
Excellent. Thank you.
Building on what Johnnie said, I think you can make a theoretical argument that when dealing with adversaries, it helps to be unpredictable, and it can actually add to deterrence. It's pretty hard to make an argument that being unpredictable helps you with your allies. And that's what we really need right now. So I don't see where unpredictability really is going to work for us moving forward.
Great. Well, speaking of our allies, and since Johnnie raised the question about Russia and issues that affect our allies, such as election meddling, we have a question from our audience. Are there any measures you would recommend to immediately respond to Russian and/or Iranian election interference sufficient to deter them? Tough question.
Well, I can tell you from a practical point of view, if I were in the Department of State today, the first thing that would occur to me is that I would call in the Russian ambassador to Washington, give him a stern warning about what we believe to be going on, and saying very clearly that we will, in fact, take action. If, in fact, the level of the threat of action is at a very high risk already, I would also proceed to P&G one or two Russians who were involved in the information collection of the Russian embassy. Not necessarily their intelligence operators, but those who are engaged in their public diplomacy. I would also ask the U.S. ambassador in Moscow to undertake a démarche to the foreign ministry there, as well as to the president's office, expressing our deep, deep displeasure with their activities. And then thirdly, I would, and this is where partners and allies come in, I would go to our closest partners in Western Europe and ask them to engage in the same kind of high-level démarches as well. They all have democracies. They're all vulnerable to this kind of activity. They should all be speaking out in unison, particularly those in the European Union.
Great. What about from an, yeah, Anne, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add to that, if I were serving on the White House National Security Council staff, we would be doing everything we could to reinforce what Ambassador Carson has just said and echo that message, deliver that message from the highest levels of the government.
And what about from the intelligence perspective, Chris?
Well, the beauty about being an intelligence officer is you never have to offer ideas in terms of policy. We comment on things, which is a wonderful place to be. But I think from the intelligence perspective, it's yes, the marshes and all these things, but it's more, what is it that Putin fears the most that we could have a private discussion with him and say, look, you're meddling in our internal affairs. We have kept out of yours and we will no longer do that. There's a lot of people that he doesn't like that we could do a lot of things to support. So I think having a discussion about you're not getting a free ride anymore, because if there's one thing that defines what Russia has gotten for the last 3 years, it has been a free ride on everything that they've done.
Great, thank you. So I have a new question coming in. Do you think there are some foreign hotspots that Trump may have put aside that a Biden presidency will need to deal with? What hot spots have been ignored that you think that the potential Biden presidency would make a priority?
I'll try that one. I think, part of what we've seen is, again, this unpredictability and foreign policy that's not driven by clearly defined national interests, but more by personal interests. So I could see, and I'm not going to talk about a specific hotspot, but much more of an attempt to return to a period of U.S. leadership so that pretty much any hotspot that's out there, we will engage it at least with diplomatic effort and be much more involved in pulling our allies together and being much more activist rather than, there's a lot of stuff going on out there that unless you read past the front page, you're not going to really find out what's going on in terms of conflict. There's some stuff going on in the Mediterranean that people aren't really focused on, and in Armenia and a bunch of different places. So I just see us being much more attentive and trying to regain that world leadership in terms of bringing a variety of different forces to bear on these problems.
Ambassador Carson.
Let me just, yes, I think that we have been absent in the discussions on climate change. Mm-hmm. We have seen it in our own country, fires in the West, hurricanes and tornadoes in the South and the East. We have seen deadly storms that have ravaged our country. But if we look globally, can see that climate change is impacting all of the global community. And we need to be a part of that discussion, a much more active part of that discussion. I think that we also need to be a much more active part of the effort to address some of the root causes of terrorism that continue to threaten the global community. And I think that this is important. Zeroing in, I think that because policy has been so centralized around the thinking of one individual, and that is the president, that we have not in effect empowered our assistant secretaries and our undersecretaries to work regionally to deal with issues that are flaming in various areas. Today, for example, going on now for 2 weeks, we have seen violent riots across Nigeria. What is Nigeria? Nigeria is, in fact, the most populous country in Africa, half Christian, half Muslim. It is one of the top 10 producers of oil and the largest oil producer in the continent. It is currently fighting a couple of internal insurgencies that have regional impact. Boko Haram up in the northeast, spreading into Niger and Cameroon. I think this kind of engagement is diminished when we don't have strategies in place to deal with regional issues in places like Nigeria, places like Libya, but also across Latin America as well. We need policies that allow us to engage in a more collective and systematic way, not only in places like Venezuela, but also I would add places like Mexico and Brazil. But I think there are places across Asia, places across Western Europe, where our diplomacy in collaboration with the diplomacy of like-minded countries can in fact have a positive effort in stemming the rise of violence and conflict and helping to mediate some of the transnational issues that continue to work against us all as a global community.
That's a long list. And from your perspective, where would a potential Biden administration need to start? What would be the priority list?
Well, it's hard for me to say exactly what the priority list would be, but I agree with Ambassador Carson, and I would add to that the devastating effects of the pandemic and the backsliding, the economic devastation that it's created, dislocation, health consequences across the board. This is an issue set on which we need to re-engage. We need to rejoin not only the World Health Organization, which is one aspect of re-engaging, but we simply need to re-engage on the national stage, because if we don't, these consequences are going to have follow-on consequences, particularly potentially in the kinds of fragile states that Ambassador Carson mentioned. So these are of a piece. And the second point I'll make more generally, which has already been made, but I want to underscore, and it has to do with the consistency of our foreign policy and our engagement generally. Where we can succeed so often is in the areas of prevention and in building resilience, not in waiting for a crisis to erupt. And we need to get back to that posture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point.
Okay.
Excellent. Please, those of you in the audience, send us your questions through the Q&A function. We're standing by here. Chris Savos, so the point about having, building resilience and where would you have the Biden administration sort of start their priorities?
I'm not sure in terms of building resilience. I think they don't have a choice in terms of turning away from the issues of Russia and China. Those are the big ones out there. So I would say those are the first places I would start because the stakes are highest. And part of that is going back to this constant theme we keep hitting is not going that alone, but being a leader in terms of I won't say boxing those countries in, but more dealing with them in a way that we can manage the relationship more to our advantage.
Great. So the question just came in about sorry, go ahead, Anne.
Can I have a two-finger on that,
Sure.
Chris? So sorry.
Yeah. No worries.
I wanted just to add to that a place that an area in which the Biden campaign has already spoken, and that is addressing building relationships with our Democratic allies to deal with not only countering authoritarianism, as Chris has mentioned, but also to address the democratic backsliding that we've seen globally. So that will be a place I know that a Biden administration will focus early.
Great. So questions just come in about where are we with North Korea now?
So actually I haven't thought about North Korea in a while, have we? And therein lies the problem, because they have a habit of feeling bad when they get ignored. So I fully expect if early on in the next administration, whoever's there, if no one's talking about North Korea, nothing's going on there, you'll see some weapons test or something like that to try and get some attention. I think you'll get an even sharper response if, as I would expect, a Biden administration would try and repair our ties with South Korea. So I think with North Korea, it's no attention leads to eventually some sort of provocative action, if only so they get some attention.
Understood. Next question that's come in. Do you think China would be receptive to Biden's team repairing our relationship with them and partnering with them to develop COVID vaccines and to combat future coronaviruses? So given the groundwork that's been laid by the current administration with China, how possible is it, to repair that relationship in such a way that one could partner with China? And would China be receptive to such a partnership around this issue over which we are already seeing competitive impulses coming out through deals with particular manufacturers for, certain numbers of vaccines once they're developed? What's the likelihood of that with China?
And I'll just start off, others will have their points as well. I think that we have to find a way to effectively manage a complex relationship with China. Part of that relationship will involve cooperation and collaboration. And I think that there are areas in which we can, in fact, work with China, not only on issues related to transnational issues of mutual concern. They may be in the climate arena, they may be in the pandemic and medical arena, or in some other area. But we will also have to recognize that some of the relationship with China will in fact turn out to be competitive in the economic sphere in particular, whether it's technology or consumer goods or transportation. And then we will also have to recognize that some of the relationship will be adversarial. In things related to issues of freedom of navigation, South China Seas. But we need to find a way to manage this complex relationship in a manner which benefits us. And we talked a little bit about North Korea. And I agree totally with Chris's point. When they're ignored, they start to act up. But one of the ways of helping to contain North Korea rests in the kind of dialogue and negotiation and diplomacy that we carry on with China. North Korea is highly dependent upon Beijing for much of its non-political lifeline. And working with China in a collaborative fashion, we may be able to make greater progress on dealing with North Korea and its nuclear weapons. Sometimes it'll be adversarial, sometimes it will be cooperative, sometimes it will be competitive.
Thank you. Any other follow-up on China? No?
I'll just give you my cynical answer, because I'm cynical about most things, is China would jump at any chance to work on a vaccine program with us, because it's a chance for them to steal our intellectual capital. So they, of course, would say yes.
Okay. All right, another question coming in. What would you predict for our military presence under a second-term President Trump or a first-term President Biden in Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq? So thinking about our military presence, which...
Say something.
Yeah, go ahead, Ann.
Yeah. I'm not going to predict, but I can say that with respect to Afghanistan in particular, it's pretty clear that I think we can expect a somewhat diminished presence, but one that retains the capability to support counterterrorism activities in that country. With respect to Syria, I think it is much harder to say. This is a very complex issue. I wouldn't expect a redeployment of or a significant military presence into Syria or into Iraq. I think the American people are tired of our overseas deployments in these conflicts. And so I think that will be a factor in any consideration. However, the terrorist threat remains, as Ambassador Carson mentioned, and can spread and is spreading in other parts of the world. So that threat will be a primary consideration in how we are postured and deployed in those places or around those places.
So in response to counterterrorism, but what about in terms of other U.S. foreign policy objectives? Rebuilding, democracy, promotion?
I think we've moved beyond the point where our military in particular has had the major role in those kinds of activities. And that's positive. And a lot of that has been transitioned to civilians, which is where it should be. And I think where the military would like it to be and where our civilian counterparts would like it to be. That doesn't mean we aren't continuing to partner where it makes sense to do capacity building, but the large scale presence that we're not going back to that kind of, by any stretch, to that kind of large scale presence that we saw even as much as a decade ago.
Great, thanks. Super. So new questions come in. 2020 has seen unprecedented cartel-related violence in Mexico. How do you think a Biden administration will engage with AMLO to decrease violence and stop the flow of drugs from coming into the United States? Do you suspect we will see DEA take on an increased role? No strong opinion on that?
That one's not in my wheelhouse so much.
It's not in mine, but it's been my impression over the years that Republican administrations tend to be more likely to take a supply side approach to the drug problem than Democratic administrations. So I'd expect under Biden, we would not see a growth in that area. It would be a different approach to the drug problem rather than getting involved in stopping the violence or getting the DEA involved more at the border or over the border. That's just, again, not my wheelhouse either.
Sure. What about the attendant policy of sort of refugees fleeing from drug-related violence?
I would certainly expect a Biden administration to be much more open to the issue of refugees than what we're seeing from the current one. I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah.
And also will be more open to providing visas and opportunities to women who and women and men who have experienced sexual and gender-based violence. I think the Biden campaign is maybe slightly incorrect on the details of that, but they have spoken on that. This is a huge issue that people are facing at our border, and I think that will be addressed in a Biden administration.
Great.
I completely agree with Ann. Sometimes we forget that one of the first negative immigration policies that this administration put in place was a visa ban, a visa ban that was largely aimed at the Islamic community abroad. It was subsequently modified to include a number of non-Muslim states, but it was in fact a ban that particularly singled out the Islamic community overseas. I think that visa ban and what it has done has been destructive to some of our relationships and partnerships. And I think there will be probably a review of that. But stemming from that visa ban, we have seen a number of policies that have been implemented that undermine the very basis on which the United States has been built, and that is immigration. We have seen a sharp reduction, not only in attempts at illegal immigration, we have seen a sharp reduction in legal immigration, in family reunifications, in the lottery system, and in the number of visa recipients who are coming in through UNHCR programs. We have seen a sharp reduction in that, and I think our immigration numbers for this year, 2020, and for 2019 have been some of the lowest that we've had in the last 15 years or 20 years. So I would see that this would probably be a turnaround, and that many of those policies will be reviewed and probably put back to where they were prior to this administration.
Okay, very good. Shifting our attention back to the Middle East, question coming in, depending on who wins, will another country recognize Israel? Saudi Arabia, perhaps? Building on our news of earlier, I guess last week.
I'll start with this one, having worked in the Middle East for a long time. There's a much better chance of that happening with a second Trump administration than a Biden administration, because, let's face it, this is one of the things that the Trump administration has trumpeted as a big foreign policy win, was the fact that several countries have recognized Israel. When you get to Saudi Arabia, though, I think a Biden administration is not going to be willing to do the things that the Saudis would want in order to seal that deal. And I'm not saying that the Saudis would do that anytime soon, but I think under a Biden administration, you get a much tougher look at Saudi Arabia. And again, another place where there's not a free ride on the things that they've been doing. Whereas under Trump administration, it'll be more, I would say, what can we give you so that we could have this huge foreign policy win?
Understood. Next question moves us to the reputation of our institutions. So question is, how do we work to rebuild the legitimacy of our institutions, for example, the CDC, in the eyes of the international community and allies moving forward?
That's best done domestically by recognizing the importance of these organizations and institutions, the professional nature of them, the high quality of leadership that they have, and especially not interfering with them politically or undermining them publicly. These are the keys here. I think that just not getting in their way and allowing the professionals to lead as they have before and recognizing their expertise and not publicly demeaning them, not denigrating their leadership or questioning their science or the technology that they use to get us there, will help enormously.
That's right. And that has to be done from the very top, and it has to be done repeatedly. And it is extremely, extremely important, not only for our cooperation abroad. CDC obviously is deployed worldwide, but most important, most immediately here at home.
So there was an interesting article today, I believe it was in the New York Times, suggesting that our allies are potentially more wary about trusting even, say, a potential Biden administration, which is much more multilateral in its outlook in terms of foreign affairs, because of the polarization in U.S. politics and the belief that oscillations between different administrations will produce radically different foreign policies. Have we lost ground in this, in terms of our allies, the solidity of our alliances in these last 4 years, or introduced enough uncertainty in the direction of U.S. foreign policy for our allies to trust that there's any consistency over the long term?
I'll take that one and say that if there is a strong win by the Biden-Harris camp, and the Biden administration reaches out, like I think it will, to bring the country back together and to underscore the importance of our democratic values and principles, I think that many of our allies, our closest allies, will recognize that we have perhaps been through an aberrational political period in the United States. That will, in fact, be reinforced if, in fact, there is a Biden-Harris administration and the Republican Party and its new leadership immediately distance themselves from Trumpism and what the president is and has been doing. It will be a reassurance to them that we have gone through an extraordinarily difficult and challenging period, but that our democracy has been reinforced, and that those who were siding with the current administration start to break from its leadership and reestablish its fundamental principles. And that will depend a lot on what happens on November 3rd.
I also think, I agree with that entirely. I also think that it is not wrong to think that our allies will ask themselves for a period of time what it means for the United States to re-engage, and to ask themselves this question about the extent to which they can count on us, to the extent to which what they've experienced in the last 4 years is an aberration or not. So these are questions that the United States, in conducting itself diplomatically, is going to have to be mindful of. And I think, and it will be important to consider carefully how, as the United States government, the Biden administration will have to consider how to re-engage, and with what kind of humility one needs to engage or re-engage, depending on the issue set, because of the experiences of the last 4 years. These will be considerations for a future Biden administration if Biden-Harris ticket wins.
Great. Thank you. New question: how do you anticipate the prioritization of climate change and the environment to change with a second Trump administration or a first Biden administration? So what are the prospects for prioritization of climate change and the environment ahead of Johnnie?
Well, I think that the Biden administration would immediately rejoin the Paris climate change agreement. And in doing so, I think it will also contribute to the Green Climate Fund, of which the United States originally said it would contribute $3 billion. It only contributed $1 billion before pulling out. I think that there will probably be an effort to reinstitute some of the environmental rules and regulations that have been pulled down by the current administration. And then finally, I think there will be probably a collective effort, not only at the federal government, but working with mayors from large cities and state governors to put in place a renewed strategy of dealing with greenhouse gases and working effectively to implement the use of greater renewables at a faster pace. And I think that we can see greater collaboration on the international side. I think there appears to be a firm commitment to see that happen. And I think very big things. I think if the current administration continues on for another 4 years, I'm not optimistic. I'm simply not optimistic domestically, and I'm not optimistic internationally.
Understood. Good. Have an intelligence question here, Chris, so I'm going to prime you for this one. Has our intelligence effort been undermined by Trump as he chooses what information he wants to use? How is morale in intelligence?
I don't think the effort has been undermined. What's been undermined is the ability of intelligence analysts to do their primary job, which is provide objective analysis to senior U.S. policymakers. You have seen the senior most U.S. policymaker who is not interested in objective analysis, who does not want to hear facts that run counter to his worldview, and who has openly sided with America's enemies over the opinions of his intelligence community. So that's had some problems. And I can't speak for morale within the intelligence community because I'm not a member of it technically now, but you can imagine what effect it has on the intelligence community members when you have someone who's been referred to as our first customer, the single most important person that we write for, who basically said, I don't want to hear what you have to say because I don't believe it. I'm going to believe this guy over here. And oh, by the way, I'm going to put someone in charge of the entire organization, the entire intelligence community, who's going to make sure that I don't see these things and that the Senate doesn't see these things as well. So that does not have a very effective make a very effective boost to morale in the community. Again, just my opinion in terms of how I see it. I know I am not thinking about going back and rejoining the intelligence community in a second Trump administration because I've had my calling. That's not going to happen.
Good. New question. Will the United States be able to shift military resources to East Asia to counter the rise of China while the threat of terrorism remains high? And secondly, do you suspect a potential Biden administration will support the deployment of troops to the Sahel?
As a former military analyst, I'll answer the first half. It's kind of an apples and oranges. The forces that we would want in East Asia to counter the rise of China are very different than the forces we traditionally use to counter the threat of terrorism. So you're talking about large conventional forces versus special operations forces deployed in the region. So it really is an apples and oranges thing. I will not touch the second half of the question there. I think I'll leave that for Johnnie.
With respect to the Sahel and terrorism, and with respect to U.S. military intervention across the continent, I think that the U.S. should have a very clear strategy and defined role. And that defined role should be focused largely on training, assisting militaries to be able to operate professionally and responsibly and under civilian authority and respectful of human rights. And when human rights are violated and there is a disrespect and an overthrow of legitimate government and civilian authority, it means that we have been ineffective in our mission and that we should pull out. But I believe that we have a role in helping to train and professionalize. I think that we also have a role in providing very useful intelligence. Intelligence signals intelligence, and in some instances, human intelligence, and the collaboration with our partners to increase the ability of governments to use appropriate technologies to go after terrorists. I think that we should also aid through intelligence reconnaissance and information sharing. But I do not believe that we should deploy troops on the ground, and I do not believe that those troops on the ground should be deployed in combat operations. I think that we get into a sinking situation the moment we start to send in large numbers of operators to actually do the fighting. I think training, equipping, but carefully equipping, providing intelligence and surveillance focused on counterterrorism is a mission. I think we need to be extraordinarily careful at the point at which anyone asks us to go out and do the mission for local governments. The fight is important, but it is a fight that should be strategically done, and the front line should be with those countries on the ground.
Anyone want to add anything? Yeah, Anne.
I want to add something that's supplements what Ambassador Carson had to say about training and equipping and the kind of support that we might provide, are providing, can continue to provide in the future in the Sahel. And that is institution building there, or underpinning the importance of what Ambassador Carson said, that the capacity building we are doing is with very much the rule of law, accountability, respect for human rights in mind, and that kind of behavior can be sustained over time.
And just, and Anne is exactly right. And I guess the final point that I would add, which points the challenge of resolving conflict in many of these troublesome areas in the Sahel will not be ultimately done through military might. That is one of the vehicles to helping us to get there, or helping countries to get there. But we have to look at the root causes of the problems and try to help to address those. Those root causes are almost always found in political marginalization, economic underdevelopment, social deprivation, and the exclusion of different ethnic and religious groups, and not having more inclusive societies where governments are responsive to the needs of their people and provide the kinds of services, if not opportunities, for moving ahead in society.
All excellent points, and situations that are being challenged by a global pandemic, which makes all the work that much harder. We are coming to the end of our time. I want to thank all of our attendees for your terrific questions, and especially our guests for your thoughtful answers. And I want to remind people that we will be back on our webinar on Monday, November 16th, to do a postmortem on the outcome of the election, which we all hope will be clear by Monday, November 16th. And then we can talk about the foreign policy challenges ahead for the new president of the United States at that time. So thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you, Chris Savos, Ann Witkowsky, Ambassador Johnnie Carson, for joining us today. And thank you, the attendees. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome. I'm Christianne Hardy, Interim Director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth, and host of our program on Election 2020, the Future of U.S. Foreign Policy. Today is Monday, November 16th. We are nearly 2 weeks out from the 2020 election. While the Biden-Harris ticket has been called the winner of the presidential race, President Trump has yet to concede, and the Republican leadership in Congress has yet to acknowledge the results of the election, while waiting for the myriad lawsuits and recounts that are underway to work themselves through the system. It is an unprecedented time, even in light of the contested results of the 2000 election. In the meantime, we have surpassed 240,000 deaths from COVID in the United States, and the global pandemic is cresting in some places for a third wave, spurring renewed shutdowns and causing additional economic hardship and disruption around the world. Today, Tropical Storm Iota, the 29th named Atlantic storm of the year, is strengthening to a catastrophic Category 5 hurricane and bearing down on Nicaragua less than 2 weeks after the last hurricane struck there. This happening at a time when some climate scientists have declared that the world has surpassed a critical tipping point for reducing global warming. Meanwhile, global thugs are taking advantage of all the distractions to flex their power, as recent reports of Russian military operations inside the US economic zone off Alaska suggest. And there's lots more. Needless to say, perhaps needlessly, a lot is going on in the world, and the foreign policy challenges to the United States are significant. Helping us to understand what these challenges are and how to make sense of it all are 3 seasoned foreign policy practitioners. Prior to the election, we asked them to help us make sense of what was at stake in the 2020 election from a foreign policy perspective. We have invited them back now to help us sort through the top priorities and challenges for the declared election victor, Joe Biden. Ambassador Johnnie Carson served in the U.S. Foreign Service for 37 years, retiring in 2013 as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. His career includes ambassadorships to Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Uganda, and he held assignments in Portugal, Botswana, England, Mozambique, and Nigeria during his distinguished career, which spanned Republican and Democratic administrations alike. He is currently a senior advisor at the U.S. Institutes of Peace. Chris Savos spent 22 years with the Central Intelligence Agency as an executive manager, leader, and analyst. During his time with the agency, he ran regional analytical units tracing sensitive security and foreign policy issues in the Middle East and South and East Asia. As Deputy Director of the Weapons, Nonproliferation, and Arms Control Center, he drove agency analysis of foreign weapons of mass destruction, conventional weapons, space and technology development programs. Dr. Savos has spent time on the National Intelligence Council as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia. He is currently Director at Proficiency One, an online training company for national security and risk intelligence professionals. Rounding out our panel is Ann Witkowsky, a national security professional and our panel's expert on interagency coordination. Her most recent government position was as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Stability and Humanitarian Affairs with the Obama administration, where she worked on, among other things, UN peace operations and the U.S. Ebola response. She has held leadership roles in the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Counterterrorism and served on the White House National Security Council staff as Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control. Currently a non-resident senior fellow at Freedom House, Ms. Witkowsky is the only political appointee on our panel, having served in the Obama administration. Welcome back to all three of you. I would like to start today by asking each of you to share what you think ought to be the Biden administration's top priorities in foreign policy, before turning to the question on everyone's mind, which is how the delayed transition will affect the ability to address these priorities. Where do you think the biggest challenges lie, and how do you think the new administration will address them? Let's start with you, Ambassador Carson.
Thank you very much, and I am pleased to be back with you at Dartmouth again. I think that the administration will need to focus on a rising China and its growing power and importance, a resurgent Russia, which is increasingly active in its in Central Europe. I think it will have to deal with Afghanistan and Iraq, where there are troop drawdowns going on as we speak, or announced troop drawdowns. I think there will also be interest in trying to revive the JPOA for Iran. And I'll stop right there.
Okay. Dr. Savos, are your priorities different given your intelligence background, or do they largely concur with Ambassador Carson?
I think they're largely the same. I think number one priority is a category I just say rebuild trust. Primarily reassuring our friends that we're actually back to normal, that we're going to re-engage with the world, and that we can be relied upon. Whether they actually believe us or not is another thing. They might think we're okay for the next 4 years, but I think it's going to take a while for the world to really trust that we're back to where we were before. I agree with everything else the ambassador said in terms of China. I think another priority we're going to see is also a step back from support for authoritarian regimes. And part of that is a return to some of the traditional values of U.S. foreign policy of promoting democracy and concern for human rights. I think I'll leave it there because everything else Ambassador already covered that I was going to say.
Very good. And Ann Witkowsky, what would you prioritize? You're on mute.
Yes, I am. I largely agree with what's been set out, and in particular, I think it raises some interesting questions about how a new administration will promote the positive agenda that it is established for itself, that's talked about in the campaign. Chris just mentioned, for example, reestablishing trust, rebuilding relationships bilaterally and multilaterally. The Biden campaign, the president-elect made it clear the steps that we're going to take on climate. So that's another huge piece of the positive agenda, the forward-looking agenda that he wants to that he's preparing to undertake. At the same time, some of the issues that have been articulated by Ambassador Carson will be confronting the new team, like Afghanistan and Iraq and the drawdowns that, at least according to the press, the administration is going to take potentially between now and the inauguration, and whatever other threats we may face as a nation from our adversaries. So there are going to be a lot of challenges. And then an overlay to all of that is COVID. Conducting diplomacy in COVID, addressing the primary and the secondary effects of COVID, and just pulling us out from under this crisis. And then a final point I make is, if one looks at what the transition team itself has published about its priorities, they're all domestic. And so that's pretty clearly where they want to signal their attention is going to be: on COVID, on economic recovery, on racial equity, and on climate change, which of course also has an international component, but has a major domestic component as well. So there's going to be a lot on the table, even without an international crisis, for this team to take on when it gets into place.
So focus on domestic. How will that undermine our ability to address some of these foreign policy issues, Ambassador Carson, that you just laid out?
One of the key things that I think the Biden-Harris team will do is to revitalize, rebuild, re-energize the State Department. While domestic issues might take precedent over the short to medium term, I think the Biden-Harris team will put in place strong leadership at the State Department to help begin to rebuild that institution. I think it will also put in strong leadership in the Defense Department and in Homeland Security and in the intelligence services. More attention to the management and the policies emanating from those institutions will go along with the focus on domestic issues.
Great. Dr. Savos, just speaking about rebuilding the intelligence agency, like how long will that take? You served in recruitment for the CIA for a long time.
Yeah, I don't think it's an issue of rebuilding it, and the change in administration doesn't affect that. What's really hurt them is COVID in terms of being able to actually recruit and bring in new people. It's not really an issue of rebuilding. It's more an issue of making the intelligence community feel like it is not being used as a political pawn anymore, changing out the political appointees at the top and bringing in people who respect the objectivity of the organizations and their ability to tell truth to power. So I don't see it as rebuilding. I see it as we just have to get through these next couple months. And there's been a lot of talks about other people being removed from the tops of the agencies. But once we start in the new administration, it's not rebuilding. It's allowing the organizations to function in the way that they will. I think the rebuilding part is more, particularly at the CIA, rebuilding liaison relationships that have been harmed in the past because of some of the moves that the government as a whole has made in terms of our having to step back from supporting people who have had our back in the past.
Understood. And Witkowsky, you've done a lot with interagency cooperation. How long will that take?
Right. So complementing what's already been said here, a really important piece will be to reestablish strong processes out of the White House, out of the National Security Council staff. And here again, I'm confident there will be strong leadership, seasoned leadership there, and that those processes that we had all grown accustomed to experiencing for decades will be reestablished. They may be strengthened. And they're a very, very important piece of driving our policy and of overseeing its implementation, bringing together agencies, bringing in the intelligence community to properly inform the work of policymakers and allowing policymakers to work through in a considered way decisions that will reflect the priorities of the president and of this White House. That can happen very fast. Because none of those positions are confirmable. In fact, many times in a change of administration, what one finds is that the changes that take place the most rapidly, where they are relevant, are at the White House. And then for better or worse, it can take a little bit more time to put new leadership into place at the national security agencies themselves, because those top positions and the ones just below the top positions require Senate confirmation.
Understood. Before I ask the million-dollar question about the delayed transition and its impact on doing just those sorts of things, let me remind our audience that if you have questions for our panelists, to please submit those questions through the Q&A function, and we'll take them as they come in. So I encourage anyone with a question about the upcoming administration's foreign policy to please submit those through the Q&A. So just turning to the challenge of the transition, how big is potentially the impact of this delayed transition, the delay of access, for example, to security briefings and the like during this period of time? What's the potential impact on our national security and the ability of the Biden administration to address its priorities? Ambassador Carson?
The delay in having a smooth transition can impact national security. One of the findings of the 9/11 Commission was quite clear, and that is the delay in passing along information about the prospects of terrorist threats inhibited our ability to understand the seriousness and the risk that was at stake as the Bush administration was coming into office, Bush 43. I think that it is absolutely critical to do as much as possible to ensure that there is a smooth handoff at virtually every level, but particularly in those areas where national security is at stake. We think of it not only in the area of international relations and diplomacy, but it's equally critical too, as we're finding out with global health pandemics. Being able for our health officials to know what the administration is planning in that area, how much it has contracted with various drug companies to know how many vaccines have been purchased, and knowing the efficacy of these vaccines, knowing the logistical arrangements are all important for our health and safety and security. The sooner the transitions are underway, the better off we will be.
Chris Savos, your thoughts on?
So I certainly agree that the sooner that this happens, the better it is for everyone. I think that with the exception of specific threat information being passed along or some of the health stuff that Johnnie was talking about, I'm a little bit more optimistic for two reasons. First, because the team that's coming in are experienced. We're getting folks who understand how the system works. The system that we used to have that Ann was referring to, I don't think it's going to take that long for people to get the muscle memory back. I also think if you look at what happened in the last administration of how many key positions were left open for months, if not years, that this team is going to be much more ready to step in. Not with the Senate confirmation positions are going to be problematic, but for other positions, I think we're going to see a much more orderly stepping out in the new administration. Also, for a lot of what needs to be done on the foreign policy side, I think it's going to be much more action by executive order. And a lot of those things are going to be lined up to go on day one. So while I think that what the Trump administration is doing in terms of slowing transition is really just not acceptable, I also think that I'm not too worried overall about what the effect will be.
And do you have that same optimism?
Yeah, my basic point of view is that the sooner the better, for a lot of reasons. If there's a particular threat stream that an incoming team might not be aware of, obviously that could pose a national security threat. Additional vulnerability, create an additional vulnerability if there's not a smooth handoff between the two teams while we have one administration still in office and then another about to come in. However, we don't know. We don't know if that's going to be an issue. I just would also say, though, that in terms of workload, we now have the agency landing teams named. There are, a dozen to 2 dozen per agency. They need to get in there. They need to see the books that have probably been or would normally have been prepared for them so that they can understand where issues are within the particular agencies and then line that up as against what might be necessary going forward, whether that's putting into place new policies, whether that's policy review, just sort of getting prepared for the administration to come into place. So bottom line, sooner the better. Understood.
Reminder to our audience, please submit your questions through the Q&A function. We'd love to hear your questions for our panelists. While we're waiting for those to come in, I wanted to ask about the so-called facts on the ground that the Trump administration has put in place. What, if any, of the foreign policy actions of the last 4 years do you feel that the Biden administration will have to grapple with immediately? And are any of these potentially in direct conflict with where that administration would like to go? Ambassador Carson.
Sure, I can start. I think one place where facts on the ground will have to be lived with, but may in fact turn out to be somewhat challenging. And this is in the Middle East arena, where the Trump administration has made a number of policy decisions which have created a great deal of consternation among some of the parties. The movement of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the agreement to allow new settlements to be built in different areas, the reduction of the engagement with the Palestinians. These are things that have moved along quite far and may in fact challenge the new administration as to what kinds of new policies they put in place. Things have been moved so far that they, in some instances, cannot be moved back. I do not see, for example, the U.S. Embassy now moving back to Tel Aviv, for example. So there are places where facts on the ground have changed. There are other places and other things that we've done that can be reversed. I think that there can be a redeployment of troops to Germany, for example. There can be a redeployment of troops to Afghanistan. But some places, like the Middle East, there are changes that have occurred that are near permanent in their completion.
Thank you. Chris?
So some facts on the ground are going to change pretty quickly. The two that come to mind are our involvement in the Paris Accord and World Health Organization. Those are easy ones. Some of the ones that are going to be trickier is going back to what I said earlier. A big fact on the ground is that just people don't trust us, and we have to reestablish ourselves as trusted players. Two other places that I look at are first, Iranian sanctions, that the regime that is set up now, it's not going to be easy for that to be rolled back. So even if there's a decision in the Biden administration that they want to do something different, that's not going to be simple. And then I think a trickier one is the hard line with China, because there might be a desire to do something different with China, but I don't think on either side of the aisle, there's a lot of excitement about being seen as stepping back from having a hard line on China. So I think readjusting our policy for where we are with Beijing is going to be a little bit tricky based on facts on the ground that it's not quite clear how we step back from what that is now.
Right. Anne?
Yeah, a less tangible set of, we've covered some of the main facts on the ground, what might be a fact on the ground and what is what are moving facts in the ground that may be easily reversible. Another piece that the administration will need to deal with is the fact that our leadership has been, it's a little bit of what Chris was saying, our leadership, we've been absent in so many ways as a leader, a world leader, over these past number of years. And in that sense, relationships have shifted, the expectations of the United States has shifted. And so I think really, we've said it before, but a really key piece of what we will be, the United States, the administration will be dealing with coming into office will be reestablishing relationships and setting the dynamics and resetting dynamics in these multilateral organizations where we really haven't had, we either have been there but not played a leadership role, or as in the case of the WHO, we're really almost officially out of the organization entirely and out of the Paris Climate Accord. I think on that score, we know because of some things that the campaign has said that there will be an emphasis on support for democracy and rebuilding relationships with democratic allies. The The campaign has called for an initiative to hold a summit around support for democracy.
Mhm.
So I would say that's a particular area that will that the new administration will focus on, and will use as an opportunity to make some shifts coming off the Trump era.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions coming in. Here's one for Johnnie Carson. Bill Burns and Linda Thomas Greenfield have written, quote, "Rebuilding the State Department should be not to restore the power and purpose of U.S. diplomacy as it once was, but to reinvent it for a new era," end quote. George Shultz has written, quote, "Rebuilding the State Department and its foreign service cannot mean simply replicating what was there in the Obama and Bush and earlier administrations," end quote. What structural changes might there be?
Thanks. That's a very interesting question, and a very good one at the same time. I think that one has to recognize that we live in a different world, and that our diplomacy must adjust for that different world. We now are concerned about a whole host of multilateral issues that are increasingly important to us. I think that we need a foreign service that is able to talk about and engage on issues such as climate change. I think we need a foreign service that is more capable of talking about major health pandemics. I think we need a foreign service that is capable of talking more seriously about cybersecurity and about technology and technology changes. I think we need a foreign service that is more concerned and effective in dealing with commercial diplomacy. We need a foreign service that is dealing with a host of multilateral issues. Yes, there will be a continued need for a great deal of knowledge about individual countries, but many of the issues that we will tackle in the years to come will have technical and multilateral threads that run through them. And the issues won't be so much about the size of parliaments and the terms of presidents and prime ministers, but with new issues. I think they're also looking increasingly too at strengthening language skills among foreign service officers, and looking at places like China, like Russia, like the Arab world. These will require differences of approach than before.
What about to our other panelists? Any other structural changes that you envision in this new administration? No? So another question that's come in then. Are any of you concerned about the senior age of President-elect Joe Biden?
I'm not. I'm certainly not. I think that a person's is irrelevant if they have good health, good stamina, and strong mental acuity. I think he's got all three.
Great.
And I don't think I'm too worried, because one of the things that Ann says, we're returning back to a system that everyone's a little bit more familiar with, so that even if something, heaven forbid, should happen to him, I don't think there's any question of what would happen. Where I think under the current administration, if you had a president who was incapacitated, who would probably never admit that he was incapacitated, then I'm a little bit more worried. Where I could see a President Biden, where something happened, would understand he might need to step aside at a time. So I'm not concerned.
Ann's not concerned either. Another question coming in, how difficult is it for agencies and departments to overcome the potential degree of disillusionment, policy and priority differences, and possible structural changes that have been set in over the past 4 years? I mean, you've suggested that we're going to bounce back. Ann, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to I mean, there's an assumption underlying that question that I just, I want to challenge. Yes, there are many people who have left, let's say the State Department, for example, out of a disagreement with the administration's policies. And that's one set of challenges that I think a new administration will ameliorate by the fact of its being in place. There's another set of challenges, though, that I think it's really important for people to understand, and that is that this administration really has had almost a disdain for our career people, whether they're in the State Department, Foreign Service, in the civil service, the intelligence community, as Chris has noted in other panels that we've done here with our Dartmouth, in our Dartmouth presentation. And in some ways, at least there's been rumored to have been a number of statements about the US military, and also certainly friction with the military in terms of the way the military was utilized in the case of Lafayette, the deployments in Lafayette Park, right outside the White House. So I think one thing that will change very, very quickly is that people will have a sense, will know, will appreciate, will understand that the new administration is going to respect and nurture and develop the folks who are so important to the functioning of our national security apparatus. And that's almost as important or more important than any disputes around policy positions.
Understood. Very good. So in terms of building back alliances, so you've all mentioned in some way, in some capacity, that one of the top priorities of the new administration will be to, get other countries to trust us again, to rebuild our alliances and to reestablish those relationships. To what degree does the efforts to delegitimize the results of this last election further hinder our ability to make that happen, to make countries trust us again? But then also conversely, to what extent does the perceived instability in American politics work to the advantage of ensuring that other countries assume greater responsibility for what's going on in the world rather than letting the United States lead? Is this a double-edged sword here?
I'll say one thing about the challenges to the election's legitimacy. At the end of the day, I think what the world will see is, hey, you know what? The system still worked, and the people's voice was represented, and we actually, hopefully, will have a smooth transfer of power. So I don't think that that's going to have a lasting effect. I hope. What was the second part of the question? Because I had an answer for it, but then
the degree to which the perceived instability in American politics emboldens other countries to take a bigger lead in global affairs. I'm thinking specifically here about Europe, for example, being less dependent on the United States to lead and being more proactive.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some European leaders see this as a wake-up call and an admission that, yeah, we actually have to step up because we can't rely on the United States as much. So it's certainly not bad for us if we see them taking on a greater share of defense spending and things like that. I think it's getting them to do that because they feel that it's the right thing to do rather than they feel that we're going to abandon them in the future. That would be a better thing to have happen.
Understood. Yeah. Johnnie, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that a lot of countries will, in fact, no longer look at the U.S. as the same strong model of democracy that it once was regarded as. I think that they will see the same fissures, the same divisions, and the same erosion of our institutions that we have all witnessed over the last 4 years. I think that people will have to, and I think Chris pointed out that we'll have to regain a sense of confidence that we are the same country that we were just 5 years ago. But people who are looking at this analytically will say the United States did demonstrate a commitment to democracy with a high turnout and a strong vote in favor of the president-elect. But they will also see in those same numbers a very deeply divided America. They will see that a president has been elected with 75, 76 million votes, but they will also see that the incumbent president also won more votes than almost any other president had before. They will see that the Democratic Party, which many people had predicted would gain seats in the Senate, has not made much progress at all. And a House that was supposed to gain more seats for Democrats, in fact, lost seats to Republicans. And so anyone looking at this will still see the fissures and the divisions that they see in America's democracy. And so a lot of leaders will try to challenge what we say to them about the importance of democratic institutions, about the importance of good governance and the importance of rule of law and protection of human rights. And so we have exposed ourselves through the last 4 years in a manner which makes us more open to criticism, more open to suspicion about the strength of the foundation stones of our governance. I think we still remain unquestionably the strongest and greatest democracy in the world. But the openness of the divisions are exposed for people to see, and they will give our adversaries a great deal on which to point fingers at us about our own shortcomings.
Well, and the instability or the variance that we're watching has also emboldened certain states in the international system to take advantage of this moment where the United States has stepped away from promotion of some of those ideals that you've talked about, Johnnie, to make power grabs. I mean, we're seeing, for example, Russia exhibiting increased activity in the Arctic. Recently was within the U.S. Protected waters off of Alaska. What do we make of how other states in the system are responding to this moment, and what potential threats might we see coming from those directions? And are we in a position now to do anything about them? I don't know, Chris is thinking about the intelligence, how an intelligence analyst would look at current movements on behalf of Russia and others. What does our security situation look like?
I think in terms of Russia, I certainly wouldn't be of the mind that they're going to suddenly become more aggressive. If anything, they're going to probably have to recalibrate because, in my opinion, at least, they've been kind of having a free ride for the last 4 years. Mm-hmm. And clearly they have someone who is not as friendly to them in the White House now, someone who knows Putin very well. They've known each other for 40 years. I'm not too worried that we're going to see a bunch of countries trying to take advantage of things early on. It's more stepping back and saying, okay, this might be more of a predictable America that they had before, so I could see less adventurism rather than more, at least early on. I don't know if you two agree with that, but that's my take on things. What I wonder is the one thing we haven't had to talk about in a long time is, with some exceptions of a few things going on in France, we really haven't talked a lot about Islamic extremism or terrorism. That just really hasn't been on the board. I think maybe COVID has something to do with that. I don't know, but that's something that could certainly come up again Hopefully not, but I don't know what you two think.
Well, and given the focus on sort of domestic concerns and COVID, what's American capacity to respond to those potential threats?
Yeah, and I'm just going to follow on a theme that Chris has already articulated. We have plenty of capacity to deal with those threats. We just need to focus on them, and we can deal with them. I think the new administration will be looking at it. What is its policy toward Russia? What is its policy toward Europe? What do we want? What kind of priority do we place on democracy and human rights and forms of government? Then to comments that have already been made here, how do we approach that? Do we approach that conversation with, I don't have the answer to it, but with more humility, as more of a partner? We've just come through this election ourselves. We've come through it peacefully. The people have spoken, but clearly we are a country divided. So I think the tools are there. We are as strong as we have ever been in many, many respects, with the exception of the need to really rebuild our diplomatic capacity. And that can happen quickly, but it absolutely needs to happen. And as we need a strong diplomatic capacity backed by a capable defense. And I think those two pieces can come together very, very quickly. And the president-elect has already signaled through the campaign that's where he plans to go. So this is a question of focus. It's not a matter of capability.
And judging by the outreach that President-elect Biden has already received from foreign leaders around the world, it seems like they'd be receptive to rebuilding that communication. Would be a guess. Yeah. I want to encourage everyone who has questions in the audience to please submit them through the Q&A function. We'd love to hear what you're thinking and have the questions for our panelists here. I want to return, Johnnie, you mentioned sort of the facts on the ground in the Middle East, and I'm wondering to what degree will sort of the Middle East be a high priority area for the incoming Biden administration? Or is that an area that may have to fall further down the priority list in the short term? Thoughts about?
I certainly think that the administration will probably do a very rigorous and thorough assessment of where the current situation is in the Middle East amongst all the players and stakeholders, and then come up with a policy that best reflects where they think progress can be made. But I think it will certainly continue to be an area of focus. But I think only after there's been a thorough assessment of what can be accomplished over the next several years.
And what about in terms of the global COVID response, the pandemic response? So, I think you mentioned that one of the administration's top priorities is to re-sign on to the Paris Climate Accords, but also to rejoin WHO and roll that out. We know that there are members on the transition team who are heavily involved with the Obama administration's pandemic response. Have they signaled at all sort of what the first steps might be, or the confidence building measures for a global response in terms of a rollout of a vaccine might be? Yeah.
I just, we're in a period, we're in a transition period right now. Yeah. So I think that's the important thing to note, that coronavirus task force that's been established first and foremost wants to be able to engage in the transition. And we spoke about that earlier, to get the information that it needs to prepare for the new administration to take over on Inauguration Day. There will definitely be a re-engagement beyond the simple rejoining of the WHO. And I'm sure that everybody on that team is looking very, very closely at what that will be. The general bent, of course, is that we are stronger when we leverage our partnerships, that we can't do this alone. And that's true of so much, including pandemics that don't know borders. And so I think we'll have to wait and see exactly what those steps are going to look like in the international context. But we do know that the administration is going to put a really high priority on the response around the pandemic. First and foremost, domestically, around contact tracing, around PPE, around supply chains, around getting a vaccine when it's ready, appropriately distributed. But there will be a really critical international component to it as well, and we have to wait and see what exactly that will look like.
Well, so we know who the members of the pandemic response team are. So that's been publicized, and we've seen a number of them on news media, talking about what's at stake and the process. I'm wondering if any of you have any speculation as to who might be the foreign policy and security appointees of the Biden cabinet and what those choices might signal.
I certainly don't want to speculate on any of those choices. I think the vice president has a list of well-qualified individuals that he can choose from. So I don't want to in any way speculate on who might or might not be in one of those positions.
All right. So the betting pool will have to forego your expertise on that one. Did get a question in for Ann Witkowsky. John Kerry has said, quote, "You can invest again in the State Department, but it takes years to build up expertise and capability," end quote. What gives you confidence that we can so quickly restore our diplomatic capacity?
Well, I'll answer in part, and then I'll just lob this over to Ambassador Carson. So I think there's a lot that can be done quickly because, first of all, we still have a lot of talent within the State Department that we can rely upon. That's point one. Point two, there are statutes on the books that do allow for people who have had a number of years within the State Department to be reinstated relatively quickly. So that's another potential source of talent. And then third, I will say, I think with respect to the State Department, it will take some time. It will take some time to rebuild it. I think that's realistic. And to quote what the new administration is after, build back better. I think that's what you'll see. You've seen one or two reports coming out on the Foreign Service. I think you'll see some more. There's a lot of thought going into what a Foreign Service of the future should look like. And so I think you'll see some steps that are taken immediately, and I think you'll see other steps that are going to take time in order to realize the benefits. Sometimes things have to get worse before they get better, and I'm really optimistic about the opportunities that lie ahead for the State Department. But I should turn it over to the ambassador.
I think some of the points that Ann made are absolutely correct. One of the greatest concerns is the loss of senior leadership that has been a part of the career service for many years, if not decades. And I think over the last 4 years, 25% of the senior officers in the State Department have left the service. Some of them were ushered out of the door quite quickly when Secretary Tillerson came in to the building, and others found their services were not needed and decided to walk away. I think there has been a disillusionment in the mid ranks as well, and there have been losses and erosion of mid-level officers there as well, primarily as a result that they thought that the administration and the senior leadership were not looking at their service and their profession in a thoughtful manner and wanted to go other places. So there has been an erosion in the upper ranks of the service. Going back to transitions and what transitions can do and what they can't do and how they show weakness, one of the things that hurt American diplomacy when the current administration came into office was the failure to fill many senior level positions in Washington and leaving open key ambassadorial jobs, not for weeks and months, but for years. I know that in Africa, the area of the world that I've spent a great deal of time working, the position of ambassador in South Africa, arguably one of the 2 or 3 most important countries on the continent, was left vacant for over 2.5 years. Tanzania, another major country in East Africa, the ambassadorial post there was left open for, again, 2.5 years. In Sudan, one of the most troubled countries in Africa, we still have not had a U.S. ambassador appointed. And in other places, there have been long vacancies. Yes, the law allows the State Department to bring back in career officers, and I think and hope that probably will be done. I don't know because I can't speak for anyone, but I think you have seen things that suggest that that might happen. But one of the things that it does take a long time to do, and that is to build a cadre of Arabic speakers, build a cadre of Chinese speakers, build a cadre of people who can work in different parts of the world with a great expertise, language ability, and an understanding of the politics, culture, and the transnational issues that are out there. And that does, in fact, take a great deal of time if you're going to build a career service and a cadre of men and women who are able to carry out diplomatic activities over a long period of time. It does take time to build that expertise. The reintroduction or rehiring of officers will be important, but that is only a stopgap until more junior and mid-level officers gain greater area, linguistic, regional, and functional expertise.
So a bit of a divergence in the sense of the quick turnover is not going to happen in order to develop that level of expertise. I'm curious, given the departures within the State Department, we're now seeing, of course, a purging at defense from the current administration. I'm curious about what impact, if any, that's going to have in the transition. And will the FBI and the CIA go the same way before January 20th? Anne?
Yeah, I could just speak just very briefly to defense. Just to be clear, the purge has happened at the political level.
Yeah.
I have a lot of questions, as many people do, about the rationale for it and the rationale for putting the individuals into place in the positions of those who have been asked to leave. But again, in many places in the Defense Department, well, first of all, the career folks are still present and working, our civilians and our military, the contractors who are in the department, primarily the civilians and our military career folks. And in addition to that, in parts of the Defense Department, we've seen what the Foreign Service has seen, not to the same degree, but then a lot of positions have gone unfilled anyway for a long period of time. So I don't mean to diminish the seriousness of what we're seeing right now, but I think the new team will be able to come in on the department. Hopefully, there won't be serious issues between now and the inauguration. It is not a great time to have had a tremendous turnover in senior leadership. If we can get through that, then I think we won't see a huge difference as between a situation where the current leadership was left in place and not. Although one other point I'd just like to make, and that is in terms of the handoff, the briefings, the ability to converse and understand where we are, therefore where we need to go, there might be some effect and some impact on that in some areas with all these new folks coming in just now.
Understood.
I say on the intelligence side, you can't purge much. You have the director, and I can't remember if the deputy director is appointed or not, but there are no political appointees throughout the organization. Mm-hmm. So you would have to get rid of the current director, bring in an acting director who would not have the power to just outright fire people. He could remove the heads of the directorates, but that could all be easily undone. So the intelligence community, thankfully, is somewhat resistant to the types of purges that you could have in the State Department, the Department of Defense, where there are a lot more appointees.
And did the intelligence community have some of this sort of vacancy or flight that has been described in more diplomatic terms by Johnnie Carson, as it happened in the State Department and as Anne mentioned in defense, some positions that went unfilled?
Not in terms of positions unfilled, because again, it does not require any action from outside of the building to fill those positions. So there were never positions that were unfilled. And I know of individuals who left, who worked with this administration and got burned out, but very small numbers. Mm-hmm. So business continues along as usual. The big thing that's actually affecting retirements more is you have just a workforce that has reached an age where some of them, particularly on the analytics side, you have senior people who are eligible to retire. And what's happened with COVID is a lot of people are staying home and realizing this isn't too bad. Maybe I'll retire. But that's been matched equally by people saying, I don't like this. Maybe I'm not ready to retire. So I think retirements are much more being driven just by people's personal preferences. I do believe, however, that had we had the second Trump administration, a lot of my friends who are eligible for retirement would say, why am I doing this and being vilified for the job that I'm doing, and would have left. So I think they'll stay. But in terms of a purge or widespread people leaving for the door, that just didn't happen.
Understood. Now, one last question before we close it for this evening. When we talk about the transition, there are some appointments that do require confirmation. And to what degree does the lack of bipartisanship at the moment suggest that confirmation process will be protracted or difficult? With very narrow, no sense of it. Yeah.
Well, certainly there are lots of positions in the State Department that have to have Senate confirmation. Everything from the secretary all the way down to the assistant secretaries who run regional and functional bureaus, as well as the over 150 ambassadorial positions that are out there. Some are filled by career officers, some are filled by political appointees. So there will be a large number of people from the State Department who will have to go before the Senate for confirmation. One last note on State Department and what has happened too is that there have been political appointees put in place at lower and lower and more places in the State Department. I think of all of the regional assistant secretaries, those who are responsible for bureaus for areas of the world, I think all but one were political appointees. In many years past, both under Republican and Democratic administrations, there has been a strong tendency to promote career officers into those senior positions as assistant secretaries of state. That has started to change, and it changed quite dramatically under Tillerson and under Pompeo, and most of the senior officers at the Assistant Secretary of State level and above have been political appointees and not career officers. And I think to restore some of the morale and the professionalism in the State Department, there needs to be a movement to turn some of these positions back into ones held by career officers, professional foreign service officers, rather than political appointees. And I would argue that without the leadership of assistant secretaries and undersecretaries to provide policy and guidance, those below are left at a disadvantage as to precisely what the policies in a particular country and region are going to be.
Right. Very good. Well, thank you, Ambassador Carson. We have now reached the end of our time. I want to thank all three of you, Ann Witkowsky, Chris Savos, and Ambassador Johnnie Carson, for joining us not just today, but earlier to talk about the future of U.S. foreign policy. Lots going on. It'll be interesting to see how things evolve in the next days, weeks, and months, but we very much appreciate your expertise and your time. Thank you all so much. And thank you to the audience for joining us.